I'm going to get started. Just a couple of people in, but that's fine. Other people may join in. I've seen a couple of people come in and then drop out. So as I say, anybody joining in, hello, welcome. We'll try and do this live class regularly. I think just about every week I'll do at least one live class. The class is recorded as normal and distributed. So if you're unable to attend a live class, then that's fine. You can just watch it anytime that you want. The only thing I ask is that as people join the class, please make sure you're on mute. Otherwise, we pick up all sorts of interfering noise from everybody else's environments. But interrupt anytime you want to ask a question, just interrupt. Just switch your mute off and ask your question. Okay, so I think that this is where we left off last time. And we're talking about investigating the crime scene itself. And this, I think, was the last slide that we did. And we have arrived on a crime scene. Something has happened, something dreadful has happened, perhaps there's a murder or whatever. And there is evidence present all over that crime scene. That crime scene is potentially full of evidence, which could tell us a story about what has happened. But the evidence is useless unless it is recognized as being evidentiary and unless it is processed properly. That very often means it has to be collected in some form and it has to be processed correctly and analyzed correctly. And you'll understand more about what I mean as we go through this. So some of the evidence may be very obvious. In this case, there's a massive piece of evidence which is lying there, a hammer, which maybe has been used in the commission of the crime. That is an obvious piece of evidence, but there is much of the evidence that is present at a crime scene may be much smaller and much more easily overlooked. And that is referred to as trace evidence. And much of the evidence that is gathered at a crime scene will be trace evidence. And that extends all sorts of things. It can be hairs, fibers, blood spatter, fingerprints, soil, glass chips, paint chips. All sorts of things may be present at that crime scene which could help to explain what has happened and provide links between a potential suspect and the crime itself. But that evidence has to be properly collected. It has to be recognized, first of all, as having evidentiary value, potential evidentiary value, and it has to be collected properly. And that requires skill. In many cases, it is up to the skill of the investigating officers, the police officers, the detectives present at the crime scene. But increasingly, precincts are employing evidentiary technicians whose sole job it is to go to a crime scene and collect as much evidence as they can. And they are specially trained, usually within the precinct itself. They are trained to recognize potential evidence. But the collection of evidence is as important as recognizing that it is there. And it may be extremely obscure. For example, at a crime scene, things like upholstery, the chairs, carpets, etc., must be carefully examined because the fibers of these textiles can actually trap evidence. And so it has to be recognized that there may be stuff present. They can be swept, brushed, and the brushings collected in case there is evidence present. That is the sort of thing that they would do. They may even extend to vacuuming carpets, but they very often are depending on the fact that they are eyeing the environment and spotting where evidence may lie. Especially in the days of DNA analysis, things like fingernail scrapings are tremendously important, but this very often is not done at the crime scene. Instead, the evidence which may be collected from under fingernail, say, of a victim, is preserved by bagging the hands, for example. And that would form part of a post-mortem examination, which we'll talk about later. But there you see what is happening is that somebody is recognizing the potential for evidence to be present. So the victim may have their hands bagged to preserve the evidence which is present on their hands. In addition, things like clothing, both of a victim and of a suspect, may be carrying evidence. It may be carrying blood spatter, gunpowder residue, fibers from the scene itself. So clothing, for example, of a victim is very carefully examined and preserved, say at the scene of the post-mortem. Likewise, any suspect, their clothing may be impounded as potential evidence because it actually contains trace evidence. When evidence like this is collected, it's really important that it is collected in such a way that the evidence is not altered any more than it absolutely has to be. Some degree of alteration may be necessary. For example, something like a body fluid, like blood, semen, something like this. When it is collected, it is inevitably going to undergo changes. Just drying, for example, is going to induce changes in the evidence. But the evidence must be collected and preserved in such a way that any damage to the evidence is minimized. And it's understood. It's understood how was this piece of cloth or whatever with a stain on it, how was this treated? Was it treated properly so that we can expect that it will produce good evidence when it's finally analyzed? It's very easy for people collecting evidence to damage the evidence. And it is emphasized over and over and over again to people collecting evidence that it must be handled carefully so that damage is not done to it, to remove information from it that might otherwise be there. For that reason, people at the crime scene will very often wear latex gloves, collect evidence with forceps or as anything which will enable them to handle it as carefully as possible. It may extend to people coming into the crime scene being asked to wear booties or even coverings over their clothing. It just depends on the nature of the crime scene. And that is usually up to the commanding officer who is in charge of the crime scene to decide what degree of protection people need to be wearing when they come into the crime scene. As I told you, some evidence, it's inevitable that some change will take place. And this is especially true of biological specimens. And we'll talk a little bit more in a while about how those are dealt with. The evidence is always stored in a protective environment. And pieces of evidence are usually, you try as far as possible to keep individual pieces of evidence separate from one another, even though this has a disadvantage. And that is that very often an enormous amount of material is collected. So a case may end up with hundreds of different containers containing individual pieces of evidence. For this reason, a very careful record has to be kept of every single piece of evidence that is collected. And there is a special way of logging them and then tracking them, which I'll describe in a minute. Evidence technicians will use virtually any suitable container to contain evidence that they collect. And the go-to pieces of equipment are manila brown envelopes, and then containers like vials, pill boxes, and that sort of thing. Each of those is going to be labeled and maybe put into a separate bag or something else to ensure that small vials, things like this, are not lost. But the one thing that you will see over and over and over again are these brown manila envelopes. And that's for very good reason. First of all, those envelopes are specially designed so that they're completely sealed. This is not like a letter envelope, which has gaps at the corners, which stuff could leak in or out. These manila envelopes, when you seal them, they are completely sealed. The interior is completely isolated, so that nothing leaves and nothing enters into it. Often, also, they will use plastic evidence bags, but those can only be used for material which is dry. You cannot store evidence which is damp or wet, like something with a body fluid on it, in a plastic envelope, because it will deteriorate. It'll begin to decay in the humidity that results. Very small things, very small pieces of evidence, chips of glass, for instance, or hairs, or fibers, which are being recovered in order to make, for convenience sake, they will often be wrapped in paper and then stored in an envelope or a plastic bag, something like that. There's another case where evidence has a special container, and that is at arson scenes, which I'll show you in a minute. Evidence at arson scenes is carefully preserved in a particular way because it often has traces of accelerants, of things like gasoline, that sort of thing on it. And we don't want that to evaporate and be lost. Those vapors themselves are evidentiary. So in arson scenes, we use an airtight sealed container, which I'll show you in a minute. So I said that the manila envelopes have various reasons why they're important. And first of all, they're sealed, but second of all, they're on the front of each of those evidence envelopes. You will see here, you can't see it clearly here, but I'll just describe to you what it is. We'll see it more clearly in a while. There is all the detail about the evidence itself. That is, who collected it, what was the date and time that it was collected, where was it collected, a case number. When a case number is assigned, the case number will be assigned. The lead officer will probably have his name entered here, so that if anybody using this evidence, examining this evidence, needs to get hold of somebody, they get hold of the officer in charge. But underneath here, we'll see it again in a while, there is a listing. And that listing is of everybody who has received that envelope. This piece of evidence, any piece of evidence like this, never leaves what is referred to as a chain of custody. Somebody always signs to say they have it in their possession and they are in charge of it. So it may be collected by an evidence technician. The evidence technician keeps it in it is in their charge until such time as they hand it over. Maybe this is some blood evidence or something. The evidence technician is not going to be examining the blood. Instead, the evidence technician is going to be taking that to somebody who will be examining the blood. When that happens, when they arrive, the evidence technician signs out. He said, the evidence technician, she says, right, I'm giving up evidence custody now, and I'm handing it over to so-and-so. And they sign in, and that time must match. When this person receives it, that person is giving it up. All the way through, right up until when the evidence has been completely processed, there's a complete chain of custody. And many cases have founded because the chain of custody was broken. There was a time when the custody of the evidence was lost. And this is very dangerous because it means that for a time, nobody had charge of this piece of evidence. We don't know what happened to it during that time. We don't. If I see that this evidence envelope had been opened, I can go and I can ask this person, did you open this envelope? If the chain of custody is broken, there is a time when this envelope could have been opened and evidence could have been tampered with that we have no record of. So defense counsel will often want to know that essential evidence, important evidence, the chain of custody was carefully preserved. And if it was ever broken, if evidence was carelessly treated, which happens, it does happen, then it is grounds for throwing that evidence out of consideration, no matter how important it seems to be. So any container, whether it's a manila envelope or a plastic envelope, whatever, everything that constitutes evidence in one way or another, there is evidence of a chain of custody for that piece of evidence is maintained. Very easy on a manila envelope because it's paper. These are pillboxes, and pillboxes, any sort of container like this, their evidence can be placed in it. Some details given on the lid to say exactly what it is, but they would be individually stored in a plastic envelope. And again, a chain of custody will be established and maintained for them. These are canisters which are used in arson cases. And they are airtight metal canisters. The interior is completely non-reactive, and it's not, so that it has to be, so that it doesn't give, it's not itself giving off any gases or anything like that. Any material collected at an arson scene is placed in here, and the lid is closed. And you'll see that they have a rubber bung, a cork in the top here. And that is so that material inside here, if it has things like gasoline or other accelerants, which an arsonist could have used to start a fire, which is very, very, very common, any of those accelerants will have soaked into material at the arson scene. And even if it is burned, it is very seldom that all of the accelerant is burned off. Instead, when it's stored like this, the charcoal or whatever it is continues to produce vapors of accelerant, which accumulate in here. And you can put in a syringe needle in here and actually sample the gas, sample the head space in this container, and then analyze it. So you can get evidence without ever having opened this container. This is typical for arson investigations. And one of the first things that an arson investigator will do is look for a burn pattern that looks as if accelerants were used, and then collect charcoal and materials in the vicinity and store them like this. This is, I said, when, if you have very fine things like hair or glass fragments, paint chips or something like that, they are so small that it's very easy if you put them into an envelope. It'd be very easy either to lose them just in that envelope or have them be crushed and everything inside the envelope. So often a paper fold is used, but it's got a special name. It's called a druggist fold. Now, nowadays, it doesn't mean anything to us. But in the old days, when you went to the pharmacy, the druggist would very often make up a headache powder for you or whatever, and they would put it into a little paper fold like this, one dose in a paper fold like this, and it's still got that name. It's called a druggist fold, and all it is folded paper. It's just paper folded up so that it keeps small pieces of evidence discreet and safe. And now, biological samples have to be very carefully treated. the reason for that is it's very easy for them to degrade. The proper way to treat biological sample, the commonest samples would be things like blood, saliva, semen, these kinds of biological fluids. If they are damp at the scene of the crime, say on material, on a sheet or something like that, then that as soon as possible, that material is allowed to air dry. The damage that does damage the sample. It does degrade it to a certain extent, but the damage done by drying that sample is much less than the damage that accumulates if you keep it wet. If it remains wet, all sorts of decay processes happen. For a start, those samples like blood, semen, they are full of enzymes which continue to operate and continue to break down proteins and things in the sample as long as it's damp. So those are decay processes that just proceed spontaneously. In addition, it can get infected. It can get infected with bacteria or fungi, which could destroy DNA evidence, for example. Instead, it is dried as quickly as possible. And then the dried sample is kept, and it's kept, all biological samples are always kept in breathable paper bags. And each sample put into a separate bag so that they don't cross-contaminate one another. This allows the sample, once it's dried, it allows it to stay as dry as possible. Once it's thoroughly dried, if this is biological material, it will usually be kept in a fridge or even in a freezer until it's analyzed. There are some circumstances, some pieces of evidence, things like tissue, body parts, this sort of thing, which are themselves evidence, which obviously can't be dried. And those will be moved into a freezer as soon as possible, so that they don't decay any further. Much of this I've already covered, but this is good for you to read through just for summary. I just want to emphasize this here at the bottom here, and that is that in order to maintain this chain of custody, one of the things that is really necessary is to maintain a proper seal, for example, on an envelope. And the envelopes are sealed in such a way, usually with a tab of tape, of paper tape or something like that, so that it is obvious when that tape is broken and the envelope is opened, so that we can keep a record of how many times that envelope has been opened, and the openings are recorded as well, usually with a signature and a date and time. So you can see this envelope was opened by so-and-so at such and such a time. Again, it's part of the chain of custody, that we know where that was, who had it in their possession, and who opened it and dealt with it. If need be, those people can be called into court. Did you have this on such and such a date? What did you do with it? I opened it. What did you do after you opened it? I examined the blood stains. How did you examine the blood stains, etc., etc. So do we have complete information about the evidence? The items, I've already said, items are packaged separately. This leads to the problem that you end up with a huge number of these envelopes and containers and everything else. As a result, the best practice is to maintain a log of all of the evidence, a listing, what was collected, what was done with it, and who has chain of custody. It is properly labeled. Biological samples are usually labeled with a biohazard label. Although it has to be said, biohazard from body fluids is very low. Nonetheless, it is labeled as a biohazard. But there are some other crimes and crime scenes where evidence may indeed have biohazard potential. For example, if there are chemicals or something like that, which could be dangerous. Plastic bags, I've already told you, are used only for dry materials, for things like hair, fiber, that sort of thing, because of their propensity for encouraging mold growth. And all of this evidence from a crime scene is usually collected and kept, as far as possible, is kept together. And most precincts will have an evidence locker. And they will have somebody at the precinct who is in charge of the evidence locker, so that all evidence enters into their custody and they form part of the chain of custody. They log material in, they log evidence in and out of the evidence locker to keep track of it. Let me just emphasize DNA evidence. Now we assume, because of the CSI effect, and unfortunately we assume that DNA is going to be the solution to every single crime and be the most important evidence that we could possibly collect at any crime scene. It certainly is possible that DNA evidence could be collected at a crime scene, but it's by no means every crime scene that is going to offer us the opportunity of collecting biological material, which could be used for DNA analysis. Nonetheless, in working with evidence which potentially has DNA evidence contained in it, people doing the collection have to be extremely careful not to contaminate samples with their own DNA. And that is very, very easy to do. If you have let's just say we have a sample, a good biological sample, let's say a blood drop, which is going to be analyzed for DNA sequencing, DNA evidence. Under the best of circumstances, when you take that blood drop, it only belongs to one person. And in doing the analysis, when the analysis is done, it's clear. Here is the DNA sequence, whatever DNA evidence we're looking for. And this belongs just to one person. Imagine the complications that arise when in doing your analysis, you actually find you're looking at two people's DNA in the same sample. This is surprisingly easy to do. Sometimes that itself is evidentiary, because it might be a mixture of a victim and a perpetrator, for example, who both bled at a scene and dropped blood. But it becomes enormously and very annoyingly complicated if what we find out is that it is a mixture of an original sample from a victim, say, and somebody in the detection team. Somebody was careless and they sneezed over a sample, for example, or they were handling a sample and they themselves had a cut on their finger and they carried on handling it without gloves on. All of these things have actually happened. And that is enough to contaminate that sample with somebody else's DNA who has absolutely nothing to do with the crime scene. And it becomes very, very difficult just then for analysts to sort out what is important and what is not important. So as far as possible, especially if they're looking for potential DNA evidence, people, the technicians or whoever will be extremely careful. They will wear masks, safety goggles, they will be gloved, and very often will have other protective clothing on as well. I've already told you about the chain of custody, but here's a good example. Here's a clear picture for you. Every envelope, every package, etc., will have its own chain of custody listing on it. Okay, so when all of this evidence is collected, as I've told you, the evidence technicians or the policemen or the detectives or whoever has collected the evidence, they are unlikely to be the ones who will analyze all of the evidence. Some of it they may be able to extract whatever information they need from it, but a lot of the evidence is going to have to go to analysts who are skilled at examining that particular type of evidence. Blood spatter, the blood analysis, fiber and hair experts will look at that. Fingerprints go to a fingerprint expert, a fingerprint technician, etc. When evidence needs to go to an analyst, it will be taken out, for example, taken out of an evidence locker, and it has to be very carefully placed into the chain of custody, so that the person, the analyst themselves, then takes custody of the evidence and makes sure that they are clearly documented as having accepted the evidence. Usually, an analyst will ask that whoever is handing over evidence gives them a complete evidence submission form. And that evidence submission form contains all the information about the case, which might be significant in the analysis. A blood sample, for example, will come in with its complete chain of evidence, but will also have details about how it was treated, how it was dried, for example, under what conditions it was dried, under what conditions it was kept, that sort of thing. It is possible that some evidence may be need to be mailed, and that may sound like, well, it's going out of the chain of custody. It is usually mailed under very special circumstances, usually mailed so that it is registered and it is transported carefully. And also, there's all of the seals and everything on it are placed so that if anybody should try to interfere with the envelope, it will be registered. When the person who is due to receive it receives it, they will examine all the seals to make sure that it has not been opened by anybody else who does not appear in the chain of custody. Yes, I know this is, you don't think about this, right? We see these, we see CSI or whatever, and we see, oh, here, this brilliant policeman sees this little bit of something lying on the ground and he picks it up and they say, oh, that solves the case. And we don't realize all the tedium and the bureaucracy that is entailed in collecting, documenting, maintaining, and then analyzing even small pieces of evidence. And a case can hinge on one small piece of evidence. And if a defense attorney can show that the investigation was careless about its evidence, even if most of their evidence was fine, some key piece of evidence was carelessly treated, it impugns the whole case. And the defense may validly say, if this piece of vital evidence was treated so carelessly, how can we be sure about anything else? And this has been and is frequently done. So it's tremendously important. Okay, so let's say we've collected a piece of evidence at a crime scene. Well, just on its own, just looking at that piece of evidence, what does it tell us? Very often it tells us very little unless we are able to compare it to something. Now, what I mean by that is, for example, we collect blood from a scene. We look at blood droplets, as we'll hear later on. They can contain a huge amount of evidence. We take a blood sample. What does that tell us just on its own? It doesn't tell us anything. It tells us virtually nothing until we compare it We need to take our evidence and we need to compare it against something. In the blood droplet, what are we going to compare it to? We're going to compare it to the blood of people likely involved in that crime scene, the victim, the possible suspects. We take our evidence and we compare it. We refer it to something. And so physical evidence is always compared to a reference, is compared to some reference. And usually that reference is the source, tells us what the original source was, and it provides the tie. There is our information. Our information is contained in that tying of our sample, our evidence, compared to a reference. And we're going to see this over and over again. Just think of some examples. We go to a crime scene. There's a footprint on the floor, and that footprint is, when looked at carefully, it has soil particles. It has soil particles in. Okay, so it's got soil. What does that tell us? It doesn't tell us anything until we start looking at environments. We go outside and we say, is this the same as soil from outside in the garden where this person that left the footprint might have picked up soil? We send it to an expert. We send it to a geologist who looks at it. What does he do? Compares the soil from the footprint to soil from the garden. It's not the same. It's different. Okay, where else can we compare it to? Well, we can compare it to where a suspect lives, go to their garden or whatever, take samples there, compare our footprint soil to the suspect's garden. Bingo, it matches. It doesn't prove that the person that lives on that soil committed the crime, but it is an indicator that there may be a link. Your link to that suspect is stronger now than it was before. But you wouldn't have gathered that evidence unless you had used a reference sample. The reference sample, first, the garden of where the crime took place. Second, soil from around where the perpetrator lived. This is very, very frequently we'll see this. And it seems so obvious, but it's tremendously important because evidence doesn't immediately shout out a story until you link that evidence to things around it. Unfortunately, often the real value of evidence is not utilized because investigators don't think about what they might have used as reference samples to pull out the real information from the evidence. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, just tell me. Okay, so, well, eventually the crime scene is complete, and everything, we've gathered as much evidence as we possibly can. And as I told you before, crime scene investigation is done as rapidly as possible. And that is for a very important reason. And that these are usually places where people have to live. And the family or whatever is displaced. As long as it's a crime scene, they cannot be wandering in and out through the crime scene. Second of all, we need to be compassionate. For example, if somebody has been murdered or assaulted or whatever at a crime scene, we gather evidence as rapidly as possible, but the people who live there have got to be responsible for cleaning up and for getting back to living there. And the compassionate way to do it is to process that crime scene as rapidly as possible and then leave so that they can get on with it. There is this issue, is something that we know of, is not the responsibility of the crime scene investigators is the issue of cleaning up after a crime. You have to ensure that no cleaning up is done until the crime scene can be declared as having been completely processed. Once that takes place and the tape is taken down and the boundaries are removed, then most evidentiary value is lost from the crime scene. It is very difficult for investigators now to return to that crime scene if they feel they need to. They can do it, and it has happened that they realize, much later, people realize we should have looked for such and such a piece of evidence, and they go back and they can certainly find it. But it is very, very difficult if a crime scene has been opened and people have started cleaning up, living there again, etc. The value of evidence is degraded. And usually you assume once you've opened the crime scene, you don't return there. It's very difficult to take evidence subsequently and have it successfully presented in court. The crime scene, once it's opened up, has to be, whoever's living there, whatever, has to be restored. In fact, there are companies that will come in and actually do that. If a family is able to afford it, for instance, if a murder has taken place or something like that, they are able to bring in a company to do the cleaning up and everything, which relieves them of the terrible burden of having to clean up after somebody that is part of the family was murdered or whatever. But that is often not possible because that is, of course, expensive. Whatever happens, once it's been cleaned, most evidence, residual evidence, is removed in the cleaning or damaged in the cleaning. So that basically concludes how the crime scene is going to be processed. Now all the evidence has been collected, properly logged. Now the evidence is sitting somewhere else. The crime scene is opened. We need to talk, though, about the issue of what evidence can be collected, because it is very strictly regulated by law, not what evidence is collected, but under what circumstances we can collect evidence. And any collection of evidence, even eyewitness evidence or something like that, has to conform to the Fourth Amendment. Everybody in the United States has Fourth Amendment privileges, and I'll read this out to you because this is tremendously important if you are studying forensic science. And it states that the right of people to be there, you have the right to be secure in your person, in your houses, and that your papers, in effect, are protected against unreasonable search and seizure. That shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue except upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons and things to be seized. If Fourth Amendment privileges are violated, the evidence is not acceptable in court, no matter how important it seems to be. So what the Fourth Amendment says, basically, is that except for very special circumstances, authorities may not seize as evidence anything which has not been permitted by court. They have to have a warrant in order to seize that evidence, to acquire that evidence. We'll see in a minute, there are some special circumstances where warrantless seizure is permitted, but they are very circumscribed. Under normal circumstances, authorities require court permission to acquire evidence in a case. Otherwise, that, for all intents and purposes, the evidence remains your property. It is yours until the court says, no, this may be acquired to be used in a court of law or in an investigation. Sorry. And this arose because previously, if authorities merely suspected that you were guilty of a crime, they could thunder into your home or onto your property, and they could seize whatever they wanted, and they could go away with it. And there was very little regulation about what they seized, and they could impound all sorts of things that were irrelevant and make them seem relevant when they actually had nothing to do with the crime. It was without the Fourth Amendment. Seizure of evidence is open to tremendous abuse. There are these circumstances where the Fourth Amendment does not apply. And they are situations, for example, where there is an emergency. If, for example, if somebody is in imminent danger, then authorities may enter without a warrant. And they can actually, under those circumstances, they can seize evidence which is immediately applicable to the emergency that they are responding to. For example, if somebody was hanging from a noose, they could rush in, save the person's life, and keep the noose as evidence. Okay. They can also seize. They can seize evidence where the evidence is liable to be lost or destroyed, where it's in imminent danger of it being lost or destroyed. For example, in a fire or something like that, they can seize evidence without a warrant. They can also, if a person has been being legally arrested, they can seize as evidence anything which is in the immediate control of that person. So, for example, if somebody is arrested, they are usually searched from head to toe. That search is being done without a warrant. And that anything, there's a cell phone, a gun in the pocket, drugs in the pocket, etc., that can be seized as evidence. But that search and seizure cannot then extend to his house. For example, you can't then go to their home and start seizing evidence on the same arrest warrant. That would be thrown out. You can also take evidence, seize evidence, if the person agrees to you doing so. If you ask, may I take this? Or if they prefer it, if they give it to you, then that can be taken as evidence as well. That is still legal. But other than that, the Fourth Amendment is very, very, very strictly applied. And there are some famous cases which have actually established this. Hold on, I just need to get rid of something. Hold on, sorry. I've messed this up. Anyway, it doesn't matter. We're right near the end. Okay, so is the very famous case called Mincy. And the Mincy case is Mincy versus Arizona. And this, for example, in the Mincy case, there was a homicide, and what happened was there was a drug raid, and the police sent a policeman in, who tried to effect a drug transaction to entrap the dealer, and it all went wrong. And the policeman ended up being killed. He ended up being shot by the drug dealer. And the other police, or the waiting policemen, they rushed in when there was gunfire. They rushed in, and they then they seized evidence, and they stayed there for 4 days. They carried on examining that scene. And the guy was found guilty, but then he appealed. And on appeal, his lawyers said there was absolutely no need for the responding police to do anything except process the immediate event, which was the other policeman's death. They did not have to seize evidence because nothing was going to go away. The drug dealer was in custody and had been taken away. The guy was dead and he had been taken away. There was no need to gather evidence at that scene without a warrant. They could have got a warrant within a half an hour probably and proceeded legally to seize evidence. Instead, they were without a warrant. They operated on the principle that they were responding to an emergency and that the evidence was seized contingent on that emergency. Well, that is an argument. That's an argument that you could make legally, but the appeal court found that this violated the Fourth Amendment, and it violated it because nothing was happening to the evidence while the emergency was going on. Once the emergency was complete, the evidence remained exactly the same as it did before, and it remained that way for 4 days. You could have got a warrant and gathered exactly the same evidence. And they threw out all of the evidence. The appeal court threw out all of the evidence. It was a very important case. And it emphasized the importance of the Fourth Amendment, that we have very strong protections against seizure of materials, even when authorities believe that it is important. This is another case in Michigan versus Tyler. 1978 seems to have been an important year. And in this case, there was a fire which destroyed a business. And they suspected that it was arson, that it was an insurance case. And they gathered evidence while the fire was ongoing. So the initial arson responders gathered evidence. That was acceptable because that evidence could have been destroyed. So there is an exemption. However, they continued to gather evidence for days thereafter without getting a warrant. The initial evidence was accepted by the court. Subsequent evidence was thrown out. It had been acquired illegally because a warrant had not been obtained. So this emphasizes how critically important it is for evidence. It has to be properly gathered, has to be properly treated. It has to enter a chain of custody. It has to be gathered and with full cognizance of the Fourth Amendment. Okay, so we leave it there for today. If you have any questions, anybody?
No.
No, Professor.
Okay. Now listen, on Friday, I have two exercises which you're going to do. You're going to look after yourselves, basically. There's a movie to look through, and then some questions to ask as homework, to send to me as homework. And then there is a short PowerPoint presentation which you go through yourself. It's all on eyewitness testimony, which is going to be a topic that we're going to discuss next time. All right. So then I'll see you then. We'll have a class on Friday, but it's recorded. It's not live class. And I'll see you. You'll see me. I won't see you, but you'll see me then on Friday. Okay, then, everyone. Nice to see you. Thanks for stopping by.
Take care.
Bye.